Hello, and welcome to the Wilson Center's event, Disease-Related Stigmas, Their Origin, Their Persistence, and Have We Learned Anything to Stop Them? A comparative look at HIV, AIDS, and COVID-19. My name is Alex Long, and I am a program associate with the Science and Technology Innovation Program, as well as the manager of our LGBTQI+ Employee Resource Group, or ERG, that was set up just last fall as a part of the Diversity and Inclusion Council here at the Wilson Center. First, I would like to say thank you to our speakers and to those behind the scenes who have been nothing but flexible in rescheduling this event so that we at the Wilson Center could observe the now federal holiday of Juneteenth that serves to commemorate the emancipation of African Americans from slavery after the Emancipation Proclamation was officially issued, years after the Emancipation Proclamation was officially issued by President Lincoln. At the Wilson Center, my work has been for the past year laser focused on global health and the challenges to society and politics that a pandemic can cause. Coming over news story after news story during the darkest days of the pandemic was a constant reminder of the human cost this disease, which still has a stranglehold on so much of the world, has caused. Through the bleakness came a crescendo of hate from the highest levels of government disguised as politics, dubbing the virus offensive names and borderline slurs against AAPI communities that resulted in a predictable uptick in vitriolic rhetoric pointed towards people of Asian descent, not only in America, but across the globe, which in some cases inspired violence. This type of disease-based scapegoating was familiar to me as a queer man who has spent all of my out life confronted with the obvious and almost inconspicuous stigmas associated with my sexuality and HIV and AIDS. HIV and AIDS were brought up to me by almost complete strangers upon learning I was gay, and brought up to me in doctors' offices without any prompting or reason, and always with a certain air of disdain or disgust that was projected upon me. From an early age, I was led to believe that so much of my life as a gay man would be gross or ruined by the threat of AIDS and how society would treat you should you become infected. Even within the gay community, the unfair, unfounded, and mentally debilitating stigmas tied to our queer brothers and sisters who are HIV positive are still pervasive. Today, we will be tackling the root causes of disease-related stigmas on minority communities and how they can not only influence our interpersonal relationships, but also society, policy, and geopolitics. We've comprised a panel of experts, which I'm honored to share this screen with. First, Ryan Ubuntu Olson, Technical Advisor, Gender and Human Rights at Palladium. Dr. Surka Sangaramurthy, Associate Professor, Department of Anthropology, at the University of Maryland at College Park, and Dr. Sherry Wang, Associate Professor of Counseling Psychology at Santa Clara University. Each of our panelists will be giving a talk to start the program, and then we will move into a discussion section where I will take the lead on asking questions, and we'll turn to the audience submitted questions when time allows. Audience, if you'd like to submit any questions, please use the hashtag #PrideAtWilson on Twitter, or send an email to mhi@wilsoncenter.org. That is mhi@wilsoncenter.org. Panelists, I will read your bio as an introduction and then let you go into your talk, starting with Ryan, then Sherry, then Surka. Lastly, thank you so much to our co-sponsors, the Maternal Health Initiative, especially Dikshita and Sarah and the Kissinger Institute, and of course, my colleagues at the Science and Technology Innovation Program, especially Liz Newberry, as well as our friends at Out and National Security and Georgetown University. So first up, Ryan Ubuntu Olson is a technical advisor at Palladium, primarily working under the USAID and PEPFAR-funded health policy projects. He has almost 2 decades of global health and human rights-related experience working in multiple country contexts on the issues of HIV, sexual reproductive health and rights, gender and sexual diversity and inclusion. Olson has led numerous activities focused on the intersections of stigma, discrimination, and violence as it impacts upon access to health services by marginalized and underrepresented populations. Olson has also helped spearhead many of Palladium's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Olson was recognized in 2017 by the Clinton Foundation for his outstanding commitment to advancing global LGBTI human rights at the annual Clinton Global Initiative University. In May of 2018, he joined a US congressional delegation to Cuba as a gender and sexual diversity expert for an LGBTI themed trip. In 2020, Olson joined the Global Fund's Technical Review Panel, which offers guidance to the Global Fund Secretariat. In 2021, Wilson became a co-chair of the Society for International Development's Inclusive Development Working Group. Wilson holds a master's degree in public service from the Clinton School of Public Service and a bachelor's degree from Gonzaga. Ryan, to you.
Oh, wow. Well, first off, thank you so much, Alex, for that wonderful introduction, and especially for sharing your own personal journey as well. I related to a lot of the things you said, including one of my own experiences where I had just gotten a yellow shot to travel the world, and the doctor looked me, I had some chills. The doctor looked me up and down, said, "I think you have HIV." And for 6 months, I worried that I was positive, and but all through her assessments and assumptions of who I was. And I think that your story and many other people's stories set the stage for kind of what we're talking about today, because at the end of the day, is it about the big picture pieces, or is it those small micro things that happen every single day to all of us in these little ways that lead to what we're going to discuss? So if I could just share with you my quick presentation on where some of my own history in this work and kind of where I see it going after and what we can do about it, particularly from a policy perspective. So I think it'll be first important to just begin kind of describing what is stigma and discrimination. And specifically, HIV-related stigma and discrimination refers to prejudice, negative attitudes, and abuse directed at people living with HIV and AIDS. In 35% of countries with available data, over 50% of people report having discriminatory attitudes towards people living with HIV. And stigma and discrimination also make people vulnerable to HIV. Those most at risk of HIV, specifically key populations who are sex workers, men who have sex with men, transgender women, as well as drug users, along with adolescent girls and young women, they face various forms of stigma and discrimination in all sorts of ways based on their actual or perceived health risks. And stigma and discrimination manifests itself in many ways other than just human rights violations that occur in health settings, barring people from accessing their health services and enjoying high quality care. A lot of people also are shunned by family, peers, their wider community, and as a result face poor treatment in educational and work settings, an erosion of their rights, and psychological trauma as well. And so what we can see from this graphic here is there's all these things that further separate, marginalize, and distinguish people because of this stigma around HIV that actually make them more susceptible. It's like this weird cycle. It's if you have HIV, then you are stigmatized and discriminated against. And if you are seen or susceptible, you're perceived to be at risk, you are susceptible. Now, as Alex mentioned, the first HIV/AIDS cases were actually reported in the U.S. in Los Angeles and New York amongst a small group of gay men. And at this time in society, if we can take ourselves back 40 years, we can imagine no cell phones. It wasn't one of those popular things to be out and proud. It was very much a shunned space. And so when the word got out that it was amongst gay men or homosexual men, the fear and fear-mongering just took over society. It would take another 2 years after 1981 for the CDC to actually officially determine that it was how it was spread and through bodily transmission. And so you can imagine those 2 years of people sitting on edge wondering how and where this was happening, let alone the lack of acknowledgement by broader society in which our own government refused to even acknowledge that it existed and often would make jokes and discriminate against local communities, specifically gay men. And it was only until gay men throughout the country decided to take up their arms and say, we deserve our rights and they need to act up, where we started seeing some movement in terms of research and action taking to support people who were contracting the disease. Now, this is US based, yes, but throughout the world, it continued to spread. And then for that, fast forward to today, where it's one of the top deadliest disease that kills people all over the world in the millions each year. But thank goodness we have decades later antiretroviral drugs that help support people to live long and prosperous lives. But nonetheless, people still face stigma and discrimination. According to UNAIDS, and what's particularly interesting is specifically the impact upon people who are key populations and how in the world we still carry a lot of this stigma and the burden of stigma that faces these marginalized peoples, doubling and in some cases tripling people's risk profiles. In 2017, 47% of new HIV infections globally were amongst key populations and their sexual partners. And as we can see from this graph, sex workers are 13 times higher to have HIV acquisition than the general population. People who inject drugs are 22 times higher. Men who have sex with men are 28 times higher, and transgender women are 13 times higher. Why is that? Well, we know from our evidence and research that it's a lot of what drives the heightened risk is the additional burden that stigma and discrimination is thrust on these individuals based on their marginalized status in society. And so we can think specifically to the health context, but we have to understand that we don't exist in silos, and these things don't happen just here or there, but they're a part of a broader system. And we can see the social and economic factors or the social determinants of health that also drive some of these outcomes, whether it's people's ability to access jobs, their ability to live in a neighborhood or a certain environment, their educational access, their food security, their social interactions, let alone the health system itself. Science has demonstrated that these deficits and marginalizations do lead to these excess mortality and morbidity, lower life expectancy, in addition to all of these other health issues specific to HIV. And this is specific to stigma and discrimination as well. Research has also shown that people in sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, and the United States experience, especially men who have sex with men, they experience deep and real fear of going out into public, whether that's interacting with the police or being a visible out person in public, facing potential verbal harassment or blackmail and physical harm. And we can also see that there's a gendered component here when we look at the different experiences between men who have sex with men and transgender women, where transgender women are much more likely to experience all sorts of violence and discrimination out in the world. So there's a very real rationale as to why people react and are experiencing stigma that is then enacted through discrimination. Again, thinking from a systems perspective, we can think about the micro things that happen to people, but then if we translate that to what the impact is on society, we can look at the work of Lee Badgett, who in 2004 developed this understanding of how economic disparities actually are affecting not only gender and sexual minorities, but the broader society. When you think about people who experience homophobia in the forms of violence, imprisonment, losing their jobs, it's not at an individual. Yes, they have lower education levels, lower productivity, but then this has general impacts on society at large, whether that's burdens on the healthcare systems, lower economic outputs, or fewer investments in people themselves. Think about all these people who, if you just tapped into their human potential, what could we do with the world, right? So then we turn to the policy landscape in which we see that 63 countries around the world still criminalize to some level homosexuality throughout the world. Some are from 14 years to life imprisonment, and in about 6 cases, this is the death penalty. Now, what we can understand from the policy landscape here is that yes, criminalization exists. Is it enforced all the time? No, but does that matter? Because it's used as a tool to suppress people in all aspects of their lives, to blackmail people, etc. Now, one of the things that I've noted from the global discourse on these issues is also that we think that criminalization is the silver bullet, that if we just decriminalize, that everything will be better. Well, we know, even in the United States, that there's still a myriad of things that need to be tackled in order to actually fulfill the lives of people who are often marginalized and discriminated against. So we can think about things like people getting arbitrary arbitrarily arrested or detained by law enforcement. We can think about the fact that people who are experiencing the real and raw forms of discrimination in the form of violence, where do they go in societies that still penalize them for being who they are or who they are? In health settings themselves, we don't have proper protocols or procedures to maintain confidentiality or training for staff to better understand HIV positive people and or key populations. And often people fear even going to the service itself, let alone facing a hostile healthcare professional. There's broader experiences of discrimination in community and workplaces and educational settings, people getting kicked out of their schools, their homes, and their workplaces. And yet there's little to no protections for people who are marginalized or stigmatized. And then also, let alone their ability to come together and work to advocate against those policies, as we see in a number of countries where local LGBT organizations specifically can't register to even name themselves and then take action. And then the broader society, the fact that we still don't have comprehensive sexuality educations that are inclusive of HIV prevention, as well as sexual fluidity and gender identity fluidity, right? And then at the end of the day, we have all these wonderful policies in place, but are they being implemented? So we can see, hopefully that gives you a very brief synopsis of the journey that and the long-term impacts of stigma and discrimination. And as we look at the overlap with COVID, we can see a lot of things happening again today, recognizing that without understanding the complex nature of peoples around the world and their unique circumstances, and in this case, specifically gender and sexual minorities, we can actually have unintended consequences and place a higher burden on those that are already marginalized and underrepresented. Imagine all these young people who have been already struggling with their family dynamics, and then they're forced to isolate with families that once kicked them out of their homes, or where they're facing violence from those they live with. What about those people who are HIV positive and needed essential drugs and medicines? And condoms and lubricants are also considered essential medicines. And yet when all of the health systems shut down, what is the extra burden on these people to be able to do that? We also have seen examples of state-sponsored violence and discrimination towards gender and sexual minorities. In Uganda, for example, there was a safe house for men who have sex with men that had about 30 people in it. And rather than respecting that they're quarantining together, the state came in using the COVID protocols to justify raiding this place and then arresting all of them and putting them in jail for not homosexuality, but still targeting them. So even though it's not explicit, it's still being used to justify violence against them. Kind of like in the United States, why you have to have a trash bag in your car, and that's the justification for them to search your car, you know? And then at the end of the day, you have all these civil society organizations as well that lost livelihoods and therefore resources. And so they're already struggling to just do the advocacy, but then they lose their jobs and their livelihoods, and now they're forced in a place to struggle. So I look forward to the broader conversation that draws parallels between the HIV movement and COVID, and look forward to further dialogue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ryan. That was extremely illuminating. And also, I understand that what we're talking about here today, each one of us, is a difficult subject matter. So I really just appreciate everyone being so forthcoming and welcome with their stories and with their research. Next up, we have Dr. Sherry Wang, who is an associate professor of counseling psychology at Santa Clara University. She's a licensed psychologist, researcher, and anti-racist educator. Dr. Wang identifies as a cisgendered woman using she and her pronouns, and her worldview is influenced by her bilingual and also bicultural background as a Taiwanese immigrant and Asian American. Her scholarship is rooted in advocating for the voices of BIPOC communities, as she focuses on the ways in which the socio-cultural determinants, for example, access to healthcare services, social support, and community attitudes, contribute to the ethnic or racial health disparities. She teaches graduate courses in multicultural counseling, developmental psychology, microskills in counseling, counseling theories, and gender in counseling. She co-chairs the Asian American Psychology Association's Division on Women. She also chairs the American Psychological Association's Committee on Ethnic Minority Affairs, which is a 6-member committee subject matter committee responsible for representing the issues of ethnic minority communities. She was previously a part of the APA's Committee on Psychology and AIDS, which has since been expanded and renamed as a Committee on Health Disparities. Since the start of COVID-19, she has been featured, cited, and interviewed in the media on the topic of anti-Asian racism, xenophobia, and cross-racial coalition building. Dr. Sherry Wang, welcome.
Thank you, Alex. I'm so excited to be here, and I also have some slides that I will share with you all. And I realized that I probably should do it in presenter mode, but I'm not quite sure if I can see what my next slides might be, so I might just keep it this way if that's okay. And you can also see I have like 88 slides, so I can jump around depending on questions or kind of where things might go. It's just a slide deck that I use. But I wanted to first say that I'm really, really excited to be talking about this topic because it's close to me in so many ways. Not only do I identify as an Asian American person, and that for me personally, and then in terms of the work that I do, this has been at the time of twin pandemics, right? It's been the pandemic of COVID-19 and the pandemic of racism. And that's for really all people of color, that we're all living in racial trauma right now. But particularly for Asian American, it's been unique because it has been so intensified by COVID-19. And I actually started speaking up about this issue early last year, really because of my research with HIV and really focusing on the sociocultural determinants part and realizing it's really about the bias and the discrimination and that we have vaccines, right? And not vaccines, but we have PrEP. We have all of this kind of developed biomedical advancements in HIV that not only can prevent HIV and not only can allow folks who live with HIV to have quality of life, whereas before it used to be a death sentence. And yet it still is limited to particular segments of the population, and that Black and Brown communities and trans communities either don't know about it or it's not marketed to them in a way that is accessible. And so in this way, I saw in many ways this play out much earlier in the same way that HIV has. And in terms of access or lack of access to resources that we're now seeing. And so I'm going to be integrating the two because my specialization is also in immigrant and refugee mental health. So the two really for me feel very personal in this way. In talking about the experiences of Asian Americans with COVID-19, I want to first say that I will not be posting images and photos that are going to be basically racial trauma, right? Racial trauma porn, essentially. And that's part of my way of advocating too. And I post this on Instagram and Twitter, and I've been really trying to kind of reach the larger just the larger world, actually, beyond the ivory tower of academia, right? Or the students that I train or the individual clients I work with, because this is really the reach of intent versus impact, that the intention may be to want to enhance awareness, and yet oftentimes this could actually cultivate greater harm. And I'll make that parallel to HIV in that way too, that some of the research that I had been doing and have found too, is that when we look at marketing for things like PrEP, right, in terms of HIV prevention, that a lot of the images have really been ones that have made or presented Black men in particular to be very hypersexualized. And the intention is to say we want to reach the target demographics, Black and Brown men and trans communities. Otherwise, people really think of PrEP as like a white gay man's kind of medication, right? And yet in that way, it has not been accessible because people have looked at it and thought, why is it always shirtless men when we think about HIV, shirtless Black men, right? Or it's not about affection, it's really highlighting the sex part. So I think it's really important to think about too with COVID-19, this despite an intention, a good intention of wanting to advocate for Asian Americans, wanting to help Asian Americans speak up, wanting to even kind of figure out how do we criminalize, that there can also be this other part about impact that we may not be thinking about. And so the distinction between intent and impact. And so there's lots of data that have been collected on COVID-19 and the anti-Asian hate that has been really kind of collected, right? Between March 2020 to February 2021, there were almost 4,000 reports of reported hate incidents. And we also know that that's just the scratching the surface. There's so many more. And then between March 2020 to March 2021, actually then 6,603. So looking at that jump, right, between February 2021 to ending in March 2021, huge difference. But this isn't, it just shows that, COVID, even with vaccines, things aren't waning, right? We may be in some ways addressing the virus with a vaccine for the disease, but there is no vaccine for racism. And so I'm kind of going back to a tweet that I had, back in 2020, and this is my, pre-COVID hair when I was able to maintain a cool short, cut. That wearing a face mask was actually very terrifying as an Asian American person, because it felt very exoticizing that anybody would look at me, and while I am protecting my physical health, right, to not be sick, it would be looked at as though I were foreign, I was new, and therefore, oh, you must have brought the disease from China. Never mind that I've gone to China once in my life, right? And for other Asians too, who have no connection to China, to be seen then as like, you brought the disease, you exotic, new coming, potential spy, right? All these stereotypes then come into play. And so, back in February 2020, I started giving interviews talking about really kind of what I've learned from HIV and extending it to COVID-19 in terms of racism and the racialization of infectious disease. And then found that throughout the media, and I'm just kind of showing two images of things that I had done in the media, that the pictures were actually of Asians, no, I'm saying Asians, not Asian Americans, wearing masks. And really then the media, unintentionally perpetrating the sense that like COVID is an Asian disease, and that Asians wear masks. And so, between, you can see February 5th, February 12th, images were starting to change to really then document Americans wearing masks and sure, white Americans, but that there needed to be better representation and not just Asians, foreigners, right, Asians abroad wearing masks. So I'm also highlighting too, the importance of speaking up and having, policies and a presidential administration and leaders who say very not only unacceptable things, but fan the flames of racism. And how do we speak back? How do we give evidence and science back in a way that isn't just like F you, because that may be the response, right? Because it's such an attack on your personhood, your community, your identities, and in your safety in terms of the racial stereotyping and the fear that was eliciting. And so I just have some examples here of how it is important to speak up and to provide accurate science on the ways in which information has been twisted. Thinking about how viruses are named, and how the World Health Organization has actually specifically said we do not name diseases on the basis of geographic origin, people, or even animals, because of what that can do, right, to an entire category. And so knowing though too that with the SARS outbreak, that was very much a targeting of China blaming attitudes, and consequently Chinese Canadians, Chinese Americans. Bird flu, similarly, we had anti-Asian messages. The swine flu was anti-immigrant racism towards Mexican American immigrants, right? MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which has been the example of do not name a disease based on geographical location. Ebola has been named and nicknamed as like the Black disease or Western African Black disease, and even Zika. And so realizing this is not new. And I think that's one of the main points I want to make, is that the anti-Asian racism and that the racialization of COVID-19 is not new. It's always been like this. And then where does our attention focus on? That our attention though has not really been focusing on what do we do to combat racism. We have actually unintentionally focused and sensationalized divides in terms of looking at, look, it's Black perpetrators against Asians based on a couple of incidents, rather than really looking into how does white supremacy, right? How does racism as a system affect all of us, and particularly in poor communities? Because if you look at the ways in which and you look at the examples of anti-Asian violence that have been shown on TV, the really violent ones, they have been in places like Chinatown, which are poor, historically poor, continue to be poor, and continue to actually, particularly in Oakland, where we first started getting kind of mainstream attention, thinking about how close the Black and Asian communities have been there, and how unresourced those communities have been throughout history, that there is a fight for resources and not necessarily because there is an Asian Black divide. We actually have so much more solidarity throughout our history, but that has not been the focus. And so realizing that in our policies too, we need to be attentive, not only then of addressing problems, but recognizing strengths and looking at the history then of how we come together. racism also isn't just what happens to you. And I think that's the other part that I really want to highlight. It also happens, it also includes what didn't happen. And for Asian Americans, it is the apathy of the bystanders, the silence of those who really check in or even know how to ask questions. And in that way, then we never get to talk about our trauma. And so there's a comparison. I've done a lot of interviews and I've had, well-intentioned but problematic questions asked of reporters too, who say, mainstream America just does not seem to care about anti-Asian violence. What do we do to make it more marketable? Is it because we're not showing as many graphic scenes of Asian Americans on camera crying? And so in that way, I have to say, we cannot shop racial trauma porn the way we have with Black trauma and Black violence, that we are so accustomed to seeing it that we become numb to it and that it becomes the only way to get people's attention. For Asian Americans, what has happened though, in terms of the responses to the physical, the vicarious, the verbal assault and trauma, the shunning, has been though that people within the community and outside of the community have said, really? Are you sure that happened to you? Maybe you're overreacting. Really kind of gaslighting the experience for Asian Americans, right? And then even within communities of color, right, recognizing that racism is a system, that we all buy into it too. It's in the water we drink, in the air that we breathe, that even other folks of color who we go to as trusted people after we experience racism will say things like, what? Asian Americans experience racism? Aren't you people like white or something? You're white adjacent? Well, welcome to the club. Now you finally know what it's like to be a person of color. So in that way, further minimizing for Asian Americans and further intensifying the isolation and the invisibility of anti-Asian racism. So I guess I want to highlight that it's important not to victim blame. And consequently, then when we have policies in place, we are not making policies that make people choose, are we going to prioritize this group over that group? Because it is about then the sense of communities of color having to fight for the same tiny sliver of pie. Whereas really, if you look at the representation, there's so much more of the pie should go to so many more of us, rather than fight amongst yourselves to the death. Good luck. And so really highlighting that when we want to talk about anti-racist work, anti-racist policies and initiatives, it means that we need to address all forms of racism, from anti-Blackness to anti-Asian violence. But for many folks, because the media images have been Black versus Asian, there's a sense for many Asian Americans, and the research that I'm doing, Asian American communities are feeling like, well, if I speak about racism, my experience is not as bad as blank. Insert any Black person who has been wrongfully murdered and killed. So thinking about folks like Trayvon Martin, thinking about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. And so in that way, minimizing then Asian American experiences of racism and trauma. And feeling, for Asian Americans, feeling like too, if I speak up about any kinds of racism against Asian Americans, and if the perpetrators are Black, then am I being anti-Black? And so realizing too, that really we can name it, but we have to recognize we're actually all on the same side, and we need to all be on the same side to fight for the same cause. I have a couple more slides and that really highlight and educate for folks why we're on the same cause and why our stereotypes against different communities actually hurt all of us and not just ourselves. And so, making sure we don't use one another as weapons against each other, but really as allies to say, let's fight the system together, right? Because it's also not like we're against white people, we're against white supremacy that really create a hierarchy for really pushing down and suppressing the most oppressed folks. I also want to make one final clarification, which is, as wonderful as it is to have a presidential administration that condemns anti-Asian violence, this is entirely inaccurate to say that the recent attacks against Asian Americans are un-American. I'm grateful that there's a lot of leadership saying that must stop, but it is actually not un-American at all. Throughout the entirety of US history, we have been anti-Asian. Western society has been anti-Asian. And so not if, but when we experience other economic, military, or political threats from any other Asian country where the US may be threatened in some way, we're going to have more scapegoating of Asian Americans. If Korea, if Japan, China right now doing so well, those competitive or human right violations and those things that are happening abroad directly affect Americans living here because of the scapegoating. And that's really important to realize, so that when we say that this is a one-time thing, this is un-American, we have to stop, the problem then becomes that our policies will become band-aids rather than a complete revamp, because we are in denial of how gaping of a wound this has been, and how pervasive it's been, and how long-standing it has been and continue to be. I'll skip a couple of slides because I'm aware of my time, but just talk about history, and I can have more of this kind of in online, on Instagram and Twitter, about really the history of anti-Asian racism and of sexualizing actually Asian American women. But I just want to highlight too, my last point is that we can't also focus only on Asian Americans and put them in the spotlight when we talk about hate, right? Just like when we talk about LGBTQ populations, June cannot be the only month when we're celebrating Pride, right? It has to be in all of these other ways throughout the year, and really recognizing the comprehensiveness and that these are human beings and communities and histories and livelihoods. And so I'll end here with my contact information and more information if you would like more, so I can be aware of the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And again, just thank you. I know that these are not easy topics, and I do not take that lightly. And I mean, Ryan and Sherry have provided a really great history and perspective on just how ingrained these issues are into not only American culture, but global culture. And Dr. Sangramurthy is going to provide an amazing zoom out that I also cannot wait for to contextualize the great presentations we just saw. So Dr. Surka Sangramurthy is a cultural and medical anthropologist and public health researcher with 22 years of experience in conducting community-engaged ethnographic research, including rapid assessments among vulnerable populations in the US, Africa, and Latin American and the Caribbean. Her work is broadly concerned with power and subjectivity in global economies of care. She has worked at this intersection on diverse topics, including global health and migration, HIV, STD, and environmental disparities. She's the author of 2 books, Rapid Ethnographic Assessments, a Practical Approach and Toolkit for Collaborative Community Research, and Treating AIDS, Politics of Difference, Paradox of Prevention. Dr. Sangramurthy is co-chair of the American Anthropological Association's Members Programmatic Advisory and Advocacy Committee, and a board member of the Society for Medical Anthropology. She serves as an associate editor of Public Health Reports and editorial board member of American Anthropologist. She received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley and San Francisco in 2008, her MPH from Columbia University in 2002, and is currently Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Maryland. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I also have slides, so just give me a moment here. Okay. I guess, okay. So I'm gonna do, I think, the same thing that Sherry did. I can kind of figure out how to advance my slides here. So I'm really excited to be in conversation with all of you on a really the important topic of global pandemic responses, and how to actually chart a path forward using guides from the past and present. I'm as a scholar who's focused on HIV for over 2 decades, I really do believe that there are lessons from other pandemics that can help us sort of provide a framework for international cooperation and can help address both public health concerns as well as real, sort of concerns about safety, efficacy, and the ethics of all of these new kinds of interventions that we're seeing. So outbreaks of epidemic disease are very dramatic, they're terrifying in their immediacy, and they have devastated and transformed human society since the beginning of recorded history. So from Black Death to AIDS to COVID-19, epidemics have wrought profound demographic, political, and cultural changes all over the world, including bringing racial, economic, and healthcare disparities into focus. So Black Death, for instance, was devastating. It killed without mercy, but careful research actually indicates that social and economic factors actually drove the plague. People at greatest risk were often racialized and vulnerable populations, the people who were unable to get appropriate care, which exacerbated social inequities. 400 years later in North America, smallpox impacted indigenous communities. Social conditions amplified biological factors. The 1918 flu struck those mainly of lower socioeconomic means throughout the world, including African Americans in the United States, who were subject to Jim Crow laws, which required that they receive care in segregated hospitals, which lacked resources. An outbreak narrative is a really important part of how to think about pandemics. It's a story, an outbreak narrative is a story that's created to frame epidemics. Components of outbreak narratives tell us as much about our society as they do plagues. They use a formulated plotline, identification of an emerging infection, discussion of global networks through which disease travel, and a chronicle of the epidemiological work, including biotechnological interventions that result in disease containment. Narratives are not ever neutral, right? They construct disease in particular ways. Frequently, they also construct people and populations, labeling and making moral judgments about them. So colonial assumptions about backward, unsanitary customs and lifestyles of often poorer African and Asian populations, which motivate often coercive public health campaigns in the early 20th century, find their contemporary counterpart in narratives which identify livelihood and lifestyle practices with the spread of disease. And we've seen this throughout time. These stories, again, are not neutral. They have grave consequences. As they disseminate information, they affect survival rates, contagion routes. They promote or mitigate stigmatizing of individuals, groups, populations, spaces, locations, behaviors, lifestyles, and they change economies. They also really influence how scientists and the public understand the nature and consequences of infections, how we imagine the threat and why we react so fearfully, and which problems merit our attention and our resources. Disasters don't occur by chance. They have histories that shape them, but the predominant narrative about disasters affirms the notion that these processes can somehow be distinguished from normal, that there's somehow a break from our normal lives. What these narratives don't reveal is that disasters are influenced by our social conditions, which often shape the course of any pandemic. The capacity of the state and the degree of economic inequality of state citizens or residents determine how successful a state is in coping with pandemics, not politics, not political leanings of heads of states. Experts have shown that the effects of democracy, state capacity, and income inequality are really the driving forces that impact epidemic dynamics. Inequality increases the frequency and the scale of the epidemic, and it undermines people's compliance with epidemic containment policies, things like social distancing or sheltering in place, because people at the lower end of socioeconomic scales often can't afford to stay home. They have to go to work. But strong state and government structures often do help offset most of these shortcomings. Countries with resources and safety nets in place ensure that populations are taken care of. Less inequality among residents also means that more of the population has access to housing, nutrition, access to healthcare to stay safe. Here, international cooperation is also really key. In a pandemic, it's essential that governments exchange information about the spread of disease, about what works and what doesn't work in containing the spread of the virus. So here, what I want to say, and this is a really important point, is that all public health is local. Responses to epidemic threats and proposed solutions among communities will vary according to comparative strengths, vulnerabilities, and most importantly, public health environments. Social context strongly influence the success or setbacks and steps to a successful public health emergency response. They're also modifiable by public action. So the ability of local public health entities to mobilize and collaborate for action will continue to influence the success of addressing recurring public health challenges from COVID-19 to beyond. Even though public health prevention often focuses on individual behavioral interventions and cultural sensitivity models to address epidemics globally, what we've seen in COVID-19 is that it's largely ineffective when it doesn't address the economic, political, and cultural forces that often shape the dynamic. And we've seen this in multiple different ways, not just with COVID, but others as well. And so related to this, what COVID-19 has done is it's exposed global unpreparedness, despite experiences with previous epidemics like SARS and Ebola. One reason for this is how health has become a commodity, which has led to an absence of functioning healthcare systems. Further decisions were being made at the country level, not from a global regional perspective. Environmental changes and their relationship to epidemic outbreaks are not being taken seriously even now. In order to overcome this, functioning healthcare systems need to be established. It's essential to ensure direction and coordination more from a global perspective or an international perspective through well-funded, competently staffed organizations. Last, the relationship between global international systems and public health can't be ignored. An economic system that actually neglects what economists euphemistically call negative externalities will ultimately exact a heavy cost in terms of public health. The onset of COVID in many countries, including the US, has played out for many as a repetition of political and a moral crisis. Many governments frame their responses to COVID-19 as simultaneously an act of war and as an act of care. So a pervasive militaristic rationale transforms the sick and those who may become sick into the enemies of the state. We're seeing this with vaccinations now, right? As the armed forces are again marshaled to combat these rule breakers blamed for spreading illness. State-sponsored violence against and criminalization of some of these communities, the hypervigilance and the policing of cross-border mobility, and a return to this notion of a militarized version of public health are among what we're seeing. The techniques of public health itself, right? Investigation, surveillance, isolation, containment collide with medical ethics of care and compassion, right? Often you can find these techniques are very, policing, they're based on policing in the military, right? As people found themselves in a health system that isolated them from their loved one, exacerbated their risk for infection, and viewed their bodies as vessels of disease, right? So public health, again, is not neutral. It's extremely based in a particular way of seeing bodies and people themselves. And I think that's really important to understand where some of these models actually collide and don't protect us at all. So disease, or the threat of it, has been a potent source of rumor and panic in modern times. So cholera, the plague, AIDS, SARS, avian flu, all in their time provoked fear and dread among groups that appeared most at risk or caused waves of terror that have engulfed entire societies. It's interesting. It's often not the deadliest disease that actually have this effect. Nor has the level of response necessarily been in relation to those diseases that were most stigmatizing or disfiguring, whose social impact was constrained by secrecy or denial and were managed through practices of social exclusion and incarceration. The greatest turmoil perhaps occurred in epidemic episodes that combine disease, rumor, and panic, united in this sort of single moment of an actual catastrophe. Or those epidemics whose causes and consequences were unknown and who advanced so rapidly that they seem to be really unstoppable, that there's nothing really to do. So in sort of some concluding thoughts, so the COVID-19 pandemic is transforming social relations as all pandemics do. The virus's immediate threat to health and life reveals human vulnerabilities in new ways, as well as in old ways. Meanwhile, it's our social response that is also changing the social order. Physical distancing, for instance, sparking like shifts in families and friendships and forms of work and care, government and expert authority, the relationships between society and nature, and this notion of collective power. Social theorists have emphasized pandemic society's heightened interdependencies and inequalities, but they've also sort of really helped us sort of think through new forms of connectivity, value, and cooperation. social action will also shape how we get through this crisis. And I think, in my opinion, COVID-19 offers a unique opportunity to really understand the social and political labor of global health. The humanitarian and medical emergency literatures are replete with the mantra of capacity building as a prevention for calamity. But in this era of new unfolding geopolitical change and anti-globalism, most funding actually follows the epidemic curve. Projects are funded from epidemic to epidemic, from emergency to emergency, from crisis to crisis, where atmospheres of fear and uncertainty coexist with an urgency to act, to do something new. But the challenge is really acting in these contexts that requires having informal social and biophysical infrastructures already on the ground that are operating, right, regardless of what epidemic or crisis is happening. Something that's often really insufficiently acknowledged, unfunded and invisible, and this is what we're sort of living through now again. So for me, it points to greater deficiencies that we need to really think through in a much more global scale. Thank you.
Thank you. And I couldn't agree more, especially with like thinking of that very old and now tired saying in this pandemic of you can't build the roof when it's raining, you have to build it when it's sunny, and trying to really institutionalize that and make sure that the apathy that naturally sets in after a disaster doesn't with this one, and because of just how incredibly life-changing it's all been. And Dr. Durga, if I could follow up, I mean, I think we as a group have now addressed how diseases can be quite easily weaponized. Are there any examples, especially against a minority group, are there any examples of that being successfully combated? And if not, moving forward, how do you see, like, how does that conversation need to shift so that we can either stop it from happening in the first place, or once we see it happening, somehow put in some sort of change that would change that?
Well, I think that, all of us would have something really interesting to say about this, but I think it's really important to understand that oftentimes we think about public health as this sort of benefit, right? As a beneficial, a much more sort of neutral and, doing well in the world kind of enterprise, right? And I think it's really important to understand that oftentimes public health can collide with ethical standards of care, especially you see this in infectious disease epidemics, right? There's certain things, if these are sort of situations in which it can transmit from person to person. So not just things like respiratory infections, but especially infectious disease epidemics. This is where public health really does sort of collide in terms of what the responsibility is to protect the public versus individual sort of ethical standards of care, or protecting sort of human rights, right? So people can be detained. There are travel bans, right? There are communities that have been quarantine, forcibly, violence enacted, in these sort of all in the name of public health, right? Using the military, using sort of police tactics. And so this has happened over and over again. And it can happen, and not necessarily, in terms of grenades and military sort of quarantines. It can happen in much more subtle ways, right? When we think about sort of, vaccine campaigns, there are these sort of ways that it can subtly coerce and can all in the name of the health of the public. And so these are really, these aren't really black and white issues. These are really complicated and complex. So for often, I teach a class with the same name as the presentation. And I think it's really interesting that when you think about communities who actually reject public health interventions, right? My students, the first reaction is, well, they're uneducated, or they are, they don't really know enough. Why wouldn't they get the vaccine, or why wouldn't they get that shot? Well, if you don't actually understand the history of how public health has operated in many of these communities, right? It's really important. So I think, people who sort of vest all interest in public health without really understanding how public health in itself is a violent enterprise and has been, those are sort of, I think, some of the conversations that we should be having. So I don't know, I'm sure others have a lot to say about this as well.
Sherry, do you have a comment on it? And then I'll turn it over to you, Ryan.
Yeah, I'm just like trying to not nod my head too vigorously with what Thurka is saying, because it really is about, what it is when we think about disease, rumor, and panic, which Thurka was talking about, what we're talking about, and I'm coming from it from a counseling psychologist lens, right? It's anxiety. And that's, when we think about lethality, when it comes to mental health illness and wellness as well, we think about suicide. People automatically think depression, but what is actually most dangerous is actually anxiety, because people don't know what to do. There's a helplessness, and there's an impulsivity. And we see that with infectious disease, right? And especially if it's something you can't see, it's being transmitted, you don't know what to do about it, then we automatically resort to all of our biases then to self-protect. And so our sense of us versus them, right? Insider versus outsider, who's clean and who's dirty, that draws on all of our biases that we have that we may not even know about. So they're unconscious. And certainly then when we think about, I think what Thurka is saying, that public health, it is about protecting the collective good. So who do we sacrifice then? Who do we lock outside the door? Who do we dehumanize? Whose lives then do we even sacrifice and then feel like we can say, morally, right? It's for the greater good. And who's making those decisions? These are all about power. Who's in positions of power, and who understands also then those who are disproportionately impacted, because those who are on the outside, they're not just on the outside because of one of their identities, it's multiple. And they don't get a say. They don't even get a chance to be able to say, well, here are all the ways in which I should be on the inside, because they are being sacrificed for the greater good, for public health.
Ryan, I'll throw it to you. I mean, your experience working with communities with HIV and AIDS, I think, is just so, this question, there's so much text, there's so much narrative around like how many ways you could go with this answer. So I am interested in hearing your thoughts on this.
Well, I'm just, and I think so, moving towards solution spaces, I think it goes back to what both Thurka and Dr. Sherry have been saying, and that is we need to dismantle the systems that have been buttressing up these hierarchical notions of what is and what isn't, and what should be and what shouldn't be, which are built upon our structural elements of racism, of colonialism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think where that begins to be dismantled is first acknowledging and recognizing that these things exist, but also centering the fact that that stigma and discrimination and all of these are drivers of all of this stuff, and that we need to have communities at the table driving decision making. We need to stop doing top-down hierarchical structural ways of doing things and reimagine what is possible at the local level first, and centering them, and then figuring out ways where we can find overlap and intersectional approaches that value the universal human dignity, as my friend Chloe Schwenke says, in all people. And how do we move towards those spaces that let our public health approaches really conceptualize the totality of who people are, not blanketly making everyone the exact carbon copy of each other, but understanding the complex nuances that make all of us who we are, and then being able to tailor our responses appropriately. That's my take on it. So policy. Oh, by the way, so for the policymakers on the call, my biggest ask would be, get out of your ivory tower, get out of the glass box you live in, and actually understand the communities you're writing policy for, because policy isn't just something that exists on a piece of paper, but has actual real world impacts, including in the implementation and evaluation of those policies. So it's important that we understand the whole thoroughfare of how a policy is impacted, because it has devastating impacts on people's lives, particularly those most marginalized or underrepresented within society. Thank you.
Well, that was a powerful way to, I now realize, literally end the discussion. Perfectly, don't worry. I just looked at the time, and it is truly 12:59 Eastern time. And with that, it must mean that we have to end today's discussion, which, I mean, your presentation spoke far more than I think my prying could ever. So I really appreciate the thought that was put into each of the presentations and everything that you brought to the table. Thank you so much for coming to the Wilson Center in this virtual manner. And this must be done again through papers and events. I really want to forward this work. So thank you, Ryan, Thurka, Sherry. This has been amazing. And we will absolutely follow up. And to our audience at home, thank you for tuning in. And, you know, on this event page, this will be here and recorded, so you'll be able to come back to it. And to the whole team at AV, External Relations, STIP, Maternal Health Initiative, thank you so much. And to all of our partners everywhere, thank you. And with that, I will close the show. So have a great day, everyone.